Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. So delighted for our second In Conversation With, and very excited to introduce you to today's guest, Paula Leach, former Chief People Officer at the Home Office and has had an extensive career also in the private sector. And today's In Conversation With, we're going to be talking all about human leadership. And just before we get started in the conversation, just a little bit of housekeeping of how we run these sessions. We want this to be an interaction and engaging with our audience. So please do ask any questions you have throughout the In Conversation using the chat function in Teams. And I will try to answer and ask Paula as many of your questions and share your comments and feedback. So the more interaction you give us, the more lively this conversation will be today. So without further ado, let me hand over to Paula to introduce herself and we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. And it is lovely to be here. So delighted to be invited to be part of the conversation this morning. And maybe I'll just share a little bit about my background, just really briefly. And then we can get, into some discussion.
Yeah,
really looking forward to hearing some of the questions that you've got in your dialogue. So really do encourage that. That'd be wonderful. So my background is all in the space of people. So I started my career, I was actually just telling Kat before we started that way back in 1994, when I was just finishing my university degree, I did a business degree. I actually did my dissertation all around occupational stress and the differences between cultures. And interestingly, that was probably 2 decades, if not more, before we started talking about well-being in the workplace. So I've had a real fascination with us as humans. I just think humans are amazing. We've all got amazing potential. And I was really interested in pursuing a career where I could focus on how do we make the best of ourselves? How do we make the best of those around us? So that was what drew me into the field of HR. I don't really like the term HR. I don't really like the term human resources. I much prefer to use the term people. I spent a wonderful 18 years with Ford Motor Company. Had the opportunity to work all across that business, everything from, working with the shop floor manufacturing plants all the way up to having the opportunity to work with the executives of that company in America. And so spent a wonderful few years working across all different functions of people and all different parts of the business. I then moved on from there after that, nearly 20 years actually, and moved into the civil service and had the real privilege of working in the Home Office. And I was in the Home Office for nearly 5 years. I was Chief People Officer there. It's an enormously complicated organisation with a very challenging brief and some people doing really incredible work. So it was a real privilege to understand that world and also play a small part in thinking about how we can, make the best of everybody's talents and really bring about some changes in our function as well. I then moved on from there back into private sector. I worked in a FTSE 250, very high-paced growth organisation, a global organisation working in Asia, America, and across Europe. And we focus very much on tech talent. So emerging tech talent, and we had an amazing diversity of people working in that organisation, which was incredible. And then that led me to this latter part of my career, or what I call my next phase of career, which is as I run my own practice now. I run my own coaching and advisory practice, and I focus on everything I've learned about leadership and bringing a real pragmatism to what I think is sometimes a overcomplicated world or slightly mysterious world of how do we actually lead people. And it is ultimately all about humans and people. And by understanding that better, we can lead better. So that's really the thread that's run through my career. And they're the amazing organisations I've had a chance to contribute to.
Yeah, and we are so happy at Civil Service College that that you were able to come into our offices today in London and share all of this wisdom. And one of the things that we're quite keen to do with this In Conversation with series is have a really good discussion, involve those of you who've joined us live today, but also towards the end get to being very practical, because this is a challenge. We are facing very challenging times within our organisations, and it's very helpful to have these discussions. But personally, for me, I think having something very tangible and very practical that people who are joining us today, or perhaps watching the recording later, can go away and start putting into their own roles and their own organisations. So let's start diving in then, because this is all about creating cultures where employees thrive. When we first started talking about this topic and we talked about the concept of human leadership, the first thought that came into my mind was, well, what leadership isn't human? So what do you define as human leadership, and how is that different from leadership?
Yeah, well, I don't think it is,
Okay.
fundamentally. So I think you're right. But interestingly, I think, you know, if you look back over the last, let's take us sort of, you know, 200 years, just for the sake of it, right? If you look at what's actually happened through industrialization all the way through to the present day, actually what's been required is always the coordination of a group of people to achieve a shared endeavour.
Yeah.
So we're coordinating people to achieve a shared endeavour, because we've been working really over those past 200 years at a mass scale rather than at a more localised scale. So that sort of defines this period of leadership, and that hasn't changed. We're still working at that mass. In fact, it's even more mass now, if you think about it. And to begin with, before automation and machinery, that would have been very much managing physical task. So people almost a bit like machine, if you like, and that is where you get a lot of the early kind of theories of management and leadership and so on. Once that starts to get automated, we get into the knowledge age, and we're managing task, actually. So as opposed to managing necessarily physical activity that people are doing, we're actually managing more sort of intellectual tasks. We're managing coordination of tasks. Well, actually, with the technological age, a lot of that is actually being automated now and has already been automated. I mean, I think we talk about the future of work. I think we're in the future of work. I don't think many of the things we discuss about the future of work are in the future. I think they're now. So in actual fact, we're at this point now where leaders are leading very much human capability. So we're not necessarily leading humans in physical endeavour, and we're not leading humans in task endeavour. We're leading humans in human to human or human to machine. And so that requires us to be able to inspire collective people to work on something together and achieve outcomes. But we're looking not necessarily for people to complete tasks, you know, separately, that kind of come together, that we coordinate. We're looking for people's creativity, we're looking for problem solving, we're looking for collaboration, we're looking for social connection. And that is very much around now understanding. It's not a tell and I do. It's very much focused on engaging our human capabilities, which I always think is really exciting, because it is, we've almost come full circle back into what are the very things that, you know, made us as a species so successful. It is very much, it wasn't necessarily our physical capability or our task capability. It was our problem solving, our social connection, our collaboration, our creativity. So harnessing those different innovative skills is around what leadership is about now. And we're much more dispersed. So, you know, we have to actually be a lot more mindful and intentional about how we bring people together. And we've got lots of different talents that we want to bring together. So one way isn't necessarily the only way. We actually want that diversity of thought. So all of those things together mean that our ability to lead each other as fully rounded human beings rather than, you know, activity-based human beings, I hope that makes sense, is sort of really the challenge and quest of leadership. It probably always has been, but it's never been more prevalent because there's nothing else to do. We're not managing task or physical capability anymore. So it really is only that that's left for leadership. And I think that's exciting. But it also does require us to think really deeply about how to motivate and engage each other.
Yes, absolutely. And I read an article recently that said the future of work is employee well-being. which I thought was fascinating, the whole article, but just that very statement, that we spend a lot of time, as you say, thinking about the future, looking at, and obviously, you know, chat GPT and AI and all these different technologies that we're constantly sort of being informed about. But actually, we see more now than ever before the difference that an individual person, people bring to the outcomes of an organization, regardless of the industry or the organization itself. So just following on from your point, where morale is challenging, is low in places in the sector, what can people do? What can leaders do to engage employees, keep employees retained and motivated and supported and inspired, especially when there is a feeling of overwhelm and perhaps low morale?
So really broad questions, so we'll just dip into a few things and then maybe it'll come up in the discussion.
And I'll just mention to everybody who's listening, please pop any questions or comments in the chat as Paula and I are talking.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the first thing to say is I can't engage you. So if I'm a leader and I want you to be engaged, I can't engage you. You have to engage yourself.
That's very interesting.
So what my job is to create the conditions for you to be at your best, for you to feel at your best, for you to be able to contribute at your best, for you to not feel threat. Because as soon as we feel threat, you know, you will have all heard of the stress response and what that actually does to our physical bodies and so on. So, you know, we want to be in a forward motion. We want to be in a positive motion. And it does genuinely, I mean, there's, you know, we could quote all the data and evidence, but there's so much data and evidence now about the difference that positivity and engagement and so on actually has on anything from customer service all the way through to productivity and profitability.
Absolutely.
So, you know, that is really very much there. But as a leader, I can't tell you to be engaged. You have to engage yourself. And my job is really to create the conditions. So I think that's the first thing to think about. Because even if you think about it from yourself, you know, we're all, I think the other key thing to do is to, as soon as we're thinking about other human beings, we sort of have to reflect it back on ourselves. So what engages me? Because what engages me might be different for other people, but the core principles are probably the same. And most human beings are looking for autonomy. They're looking for the ability to grow, create some form of mastery or development in what they're doing. They're looking for the ability to have clarity so that they actually know what they're doing and there isn't chaos, but there's actually some kind of clarity of whether it's clarity of purpose or clarity of direction. So when we're talking about creating the conditions, what a leader is really focusing on is clarity, people feeling heard, people feeling like they have a voice, that they're listened to. So creating opportunities for that, making sure that there's a sense of inclusion and belonging. So this is a little similar to feeling heard, but it's that whole idea that everybody here is valued. So how do I create the conditions for that? And making sure that we've got the ability for people to be able to have clarity of what they're doing, but then basically go off and actually make something happen because they've got the space to be able to do it, to be creative. So often I will distill leadership into two things that are really important. One is to create clarity and the other one is to get out of the way and create space. So if you're thinking about, you know, how do I create the conditions for people to feel engaged? It's those two things. And then there's lots of things you can do within either of those, but it's a good way of kind of, you know, bringing yourself back. And if you have too much of one or too much of the other, I always think of it like a bit like symmetry, like it has to be a bit like a butterfly. You actually need both in symmetry, because too much clarity can feel a bit autocratic, can feel a bit too directive. Too little clarity can feel like chaos. So you're actually looking for that sweet spot where you're able to provide both. So I'll pause there. There's loads of other things I can say about engagement, but you know, I think that focusing on creating the conditions for people to be able to step up and step in is the job of the leader.
Absolutely. And we'd welcome any questions or comments from those of you who are joining us live today. So just feel free to pop them in the chat and I will pick them up as they come in. I think it's really interesting what the first thing you said about I can't engage you, you have to engage yourself. So, and I think that if there are people joining us today or listening to this recording later who are in a leadership position, managing a team of some kind, or perhaps working within a people role, they might be thinking, well, this is true, and I understand what Paula's saying, but how do I go about creating clarity and creating space when I'm also feeling quite frustrated, quite overwhelmed? Is there a piece of advice you could give that person who might be feeling like that, who it's very clear, these concepts, clarity and space, makes perfect sense? Where do they start?
Yeah, so it does start with you as the leader.
Yeah.
If you think about it, leadership is really personal. It's not abstract to you. It is you. So, if you think about leaders that we all work with, we follow how that leader is and who that leader is and how they behave. We don't really follow what they say. We may follow what they say if it follows and is in line with their behaviour, but we're ultimately going to be following the behaviour. So if as a leader, you yourself, and I've felt this at many times, throughout my career as well, and I've worked with many people in my professional capacity as well, where people feel like this. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. There's just so much to do.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the first thing is accepting that there is too much to do. There's an excellent book recently written last year by Oliver Burkeman. I don't know if anyone's read it, called 4,000 Weeks. And if you want to get depressed, that's all we've got on the planet on average is 4,000 weeks, right? If you're going to live till you're 80. But in this, he used to do a column for The Guardian, and it was all around productivity and productivity hacks and how do you make the most of time, until he kind of thought, well, actually, this is rubbish. Time is finite, but the number of things that we need to do is infinite. So what do you do? It's unreconcilable. So first of all, I think from a leadership perspective, there's an acceptance that there's just no way that you will do everything.
Yeah.
Actually. But isn't it amazing that you've got this team of people who can contribute to working with you? So you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to do everything. You don't have to have all the answers before you can lead that group of people. And you don't have to create those conditions. You have to be able to prioritise. I think that is absolutely. So acceptance is number one. And the second one is prioritise. Well, how do you prioritise? Because you may feel you don't own the levers to prioritise in an organisation, and you're waiting for someone more senior than you to prioritise what you're doing, etc. And there is some of that can be the case. But equally, what can you control?
Absolutely.
And then therefore, how do you manage expectations with all your stakeholders that this is what we're going to do? And that is leadership. One of the biggest issues, I do have done quite a bit of work with engagement surveys over the years, and I've had the privilege of working with a wonderful company that do engagement surveys. So I've seen a lot of data. And one of the biggest issues affecting well-being is workload. So it won't come as a surprise to anybody.
Yeah.
A leader's job is to help manage the workload. That's the clarity piece.
Yeah.
And so we have to make calls about what we're prioritising.
Yeah.
So that then our team can thrive and flourish in a realistic workload. So I think acceptance, prioritisation, and another way to prioritise that I've found really helpful, and I now share this very widely, is if you've taken on a leadership role and you think, right, I'm going to be in this job for 3 years, let's say. At the end of 3 years, what do I want to have achieved? What am I actually here to do? What's the point? What's the shift we should be making, etc. And pick 3 things that absolutely you will have done at the end of those 3 years. And then that enables you have a really clear view of those. Sometimes I have people actually laminate this, they put it up next to their laptop, or it's there every day, they're seeing it. It actually really is a visual cue or visual reference to kind of go, well, hold on a minute. This, the day that I've just had, the week that I've just had, have I done any of those 3 things? No, yes or no. And again, it's the difference between what I say and what I do. So if I tell my team we've got 3 main priorities, but I don't spend my time doing those 3 main priorities. I'm asking for this. I'm, spending half a day sending loads of emails to everybody, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't help. So it's about aligning our behaviour with the things that we've said important. The final thing I would say on that is that absolutely those things can be changing because the world changes. But the critical thing managing upwards in an organisation, if you're making a decision as a leader about prioritisation, is to communicate expectations upwards. You should absolutely be doing it. And I find that often that doesn't happen because you're waiting for the person above you to prioritise down. And I think you can absolutely prioritise up. They'll tell you if there's something not right about it.
Yeah.
But it's the only way you can manage your own clarity, workload, purpose, and then manage that for other people such that they can then start taking on some of that work and it frees you up and you're able to work as a team. So there's really loads of different things I could say about that. But I found when I have conversations about this, found it really helpful for myself, and I hope it's a useful thing to think about.
Yeah, they're really practical things. It's got me thinking about what are my 3 things for the next 3 years. I think it's almost going back to that concept of working on the business, working versus working in the business, and that one of the reasons I think we get so overwhelmed on a daily basis is because we're running around doing, as you say, a sort of unmanageable amount of things. I was reading something the other day that people don't take the amount of time that they spend doing emails or responding to tools like Teams or Slack into their plan for the day. So they'll set themselves a priority list. But if you spend, if you get 100 emails a day and you spend 2 minutes on each of those emails, that's not factored into their time for the day. So it's no wonder you get to the end of the day and look down at your list and realize you've hardly done anything on it. I think it's interesting to talk a bit about workload, if maybe we can go into that a bit more, because I'm sure regardless of what role those of you who are joining us today are doing within the civil service or the public sector, we know that this is a huge challenge for individuals, but also for leaders to manage. Do you think that there are some simple practices that organisations and individuals could do with tools like email and Teams and things that could lighten workload? Do you think these things are increasing our workloads on top of all of the other tasks? Do you think they're taking our attention away and making it feel like there's more work to do?
Yeah, there's a book that's just come out by Nir Eyal, I think it is, and it's called Indistractable. Some of you might have read it. You might have listened to podcasts that he's been on. He's been kind of promoting it recently, and it is that concept of a focus actually, and how I think we always talk about how technology actually takes our focus away. I don't know whether it is all technology. So there's a massive issue, isn't there, with all of us, whether it's our phones, whether it's, and there's a lot of evidence that, you literally do, and neuroscience does, you literally do need to put that phone in a different room.
Yes.
If you want to focus. I mean, there's studies on it, in terms of focus and so on. And again, if you go off and just quickly answer that email and come back, you've lost more than just the time it took you to answer the email.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, time boxing will be something that people will be familiar with, and it does sort of work. I equally find, I don't know, I sometimes get resistance when I suggest this, but I do sometimes think, well, stop answering some things. Or maybe we just stop using some of those channels. So I was talking to a group last week, and one of the things we were talking about was, so they were saying, oh, I've got Slack, I've got Teams, I've got email, I've got text, I've got WhatsApp. And I just sort of thought, actually, why not just pick 2? Just pick 2 that you're going to use, communicate that they're the 2 that you use, and just don't answer the others. And soon people will only contact you on those 2 mechanisms. And again, that means you're not monitoring all of them. So I think that's really, that is really effective. I think also, just being really clear that actually, once you do need to allow time for these things, but they are never finished. Go back to that finite amount of time, infinite amount. The more emails you send, the more you're going to get.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think actually you have to be really, really disciplined and strict with yourself.
Yes.
About what you answer, what you do, what you don't answer. It's the same with meetings. So I don't know what people's schedules look like, but, I've had schedules where basically my days have been completely full, back to back, not even a chance to go to the loo or anything, but where am I thriving? I'm not thriving in that. And then what do people expect of themselves and of me, if that's what I do?
Absolutely.
So I think you've got to really live into this, and it's really hard. I don't think it's easy.
Yeah.
But if you do the legacy exercise that I call it, where you think 3 things and work backwards, you can't just continue to spend your days working forwards, just, doing your email, going to your meetings, forwards, because you've got to fit in this other stuff.
Yeah.
So it makes you think differently about how you structure your week. Your diary is the most important tools that you've got.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry, the camera went there for a second, but I think it's come back on. So it was being a bit temperamental, but hopefully you caught all of that. Absolutely. And actually, so outside of my work with the Civil Service College, my organisation, the Morning Game Changer, we focus on positive habits. We work with teams in different organisations. And I was running a masterclass recently on redesigning your relationship with your phone. And we talked about this concept of like putting your phone in its home, and was reading a lot about attention management rather than time management. And I think we very often go into our days and we sort of have this reactive situation where we are just responding to things. So removing and eliminating some of those distractions. But I don't know if this has been your experience, but again, I think it comes back to the culture and the leadership. But some of the teams I work with have reported that they are worried about the judgment of their peers and maybe even their leadership of how they use those tools like Teams and emails, because that comes back to culture, doesn't it, and how employees thrive. So just to give you some examples, and maybe those listening might resonate with this, but there were some comments, for example, they didn't feel they could put their, they didn't feel they could block themselves on Teams. They felt like they always had to be available, or that they had to have email open all the time because the expectation was that there were important emails constantly flowing in. And of course, the challenge with that is that you are constantly distracted. Your attention is always moving around. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, my sort of question, this is where I sometimes so I meet a bit of resistance sometimes because of some of those things, etc. And I sometimes think, but have you asked? So, have you actually had a conversation where you've said, okay, this is how I'm going to work. I'm going to practice this. Do you need something different from me?
Yeah.
So I'm going to try managing this because I'm finding myself getting distracted. I really want to focus on this piece of work. I'm going to try and work a bit differently. I want to do it for myself and I want to do it for my team.
Yeah.
So I think there's a very simple model, and I would say it's quite useful, whether it's for that or whether it's more broadly about sort of just a performance conversation.
Yeah.
Getting upstream in these things and being open and transparent, I think, is amazing, because we're all making assumptions about each other the whole time.
Yes.
We're making an assumption that someone thinks we need to be on email the whole time.
Yes.
And the whole time they expect us to be. But if we weren't, they wouldn't expect us to be. So our behaviour that needs to change, but we can indicate it and we can share it. And if somebody then says, oh, no, but I need you because of this, well, then there's a conversation to have.
Yeah.
And probably a compromise to have. So I always think it's quite useful to do this sort of what I call expectations conversation. So, and you can have it about anything, whether it's a specific thing like that or a broader conversation. You know, it's much better than having a conversation about objectives, I find. A conversation about expectations is much better. So it would be, you know, so if it's a two-way conversation, so let's say, for example, you're my boss and I want to try something different and I want to work differently. So, you know, I would come to you and I would say, right, you know, this is the work that needs to get done. This is how I'm going to prioritize it. This is the outcome. And the outcome for me means I'm doing this, or my team are doing this, and it will look like this when it's finished. So we haven't got any lack of clarity or miscommunication about how we're doing what we're doing and what it looks like when it's finished. And then the second one is what I need in order to do this is this. And it might be, I need to be able to work like this, where I've got periods of focus. So I'm going to work, so I won't be available on my, you know, email in the middle of the day, you know, at certain times, or if you want to use that example. What I can offer is this, you know, so it's, this is what we're going to be doing. This is what it looks like. This is what I need. And this is what I offer. How about you? And again, you know, giving them an opportunity to share, well, as a leader, what I need. So they might be able to say, well, what I need is to be able to get hold of the right person when there's this issue. Well, you might, as the leader, say, but I'm not the right person. You know, you want to go straight to, you know, the person who runs that technical piece of machinery if it goes down, rather than coming to me. So actually, why don't I give you their number, because they're always on call anyway. You know, and so I'm giving you a silly example, but that expectation management, I think very few of us do it. I think you can be empowered to do it either with your team to create more accountability and opportunity within your team, or upwards, or even with peers.
Absolutely.
And it's amazing, because assumptions that you have that, oh my God, I can't do that, or I must be doing this, I must be doing that. For the most part, I would say, actually, as soon as you're transparent with somebody, they're not really there. And in actual fact, you can change behaviour of a wider organisation by stepping into that. Other people might start to think, yeah, you're right, I'm going to do that too. And actually, you can, that's how culture starts to change.
This is very interesting, I think, because it all comes back to that expectations management comes back to taking responsibility, doesn't it? Our own, rather than sort of allowing this to happen, this is the culture within my organisation, but actually having, you know, being proactive and having a conversation about it. It took some time for the comments and questions to load, so I can see them flooding in now. Munira has asked, challenge, how do we help empower people to harness creative and innovative thinking and move away from following a process?
An
interesting question, so maybe choose which one you want to answer. But she also asked, do you think many line managers hide behind policy?
So, well, let me try and take those two together, policy, process. So, and I was having this conversation last week, actually, with a group of leaders from a particular organisation where there's a lot of structure. There's a danger with this, though, that we take things very, very literally and don't apply judgment. And judgment is really, really important in a human system and in any system, because policies and processes absolutely exist because you need standardization. You know, sometimes it's really, really important to follow those steps. You know, it's about managing risk, or it's about efficiency, or whatever it might be. So there's a place for all of it. But bear in mind, and I'm no mathematician, but let's just take the example of standard deviation. Right, I always think of policies and processes as, you know, your kind of linear average, where you would have a standard deviation tolerance side of either side of it. That, in the instance of leadership and management, is judgment. And sometimes it might be that a leader needs to go and seek some advice around, can I apply some judgment here? But it's about actually being able to think about, well, what is the right thing? What outcome am I trying to get to? Where is the risk? Is the policy or process serving me, or is it not? what I have often seen, and I've been working in the people space for years, so I have seen people apply policies and processes literally, where in some instances a little nuance either side would have made a very big difference to whether we ended up with a bigger issue or, whatever. So I absolutely do think sometimes they are applied too literally. I think exercising and learning how to develop judgment is a real leadership skill. And I actually think that it's one of those things that, if in doubt, but, your gut feel is telling you there's actually maybe some wiggle room here to do something that's right, but not too far away.
Yeah.
Go and have that conversation with a coach, a peer, a leader, anyone, to kind of throw it around and get some different perspectives and make a call, which is the right call. And sometimes I think we can sit within organisations where that adherence to the very letter of the policy can go quite a way up the organisation, in which case I'd go back to the point about expectation. Have a transparent conversation that says, I know the policy says this, I am planning on doing this in this situation because this is the outcome that we want. I want to let you know. And again, there's a real subtle difference there between asking for permission and stating what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Someone can still say, no, do it this way, and then you can have a conversation about it. If you ask for permission, immediately the person who might be a little more literal than you is going to start, worrying, etc. And then you will have given away your ability to make a decision or a judgment. So as leaders, we don't want to do that as far as possible. We're empowered. We should be making those judgments or decisions. Absolutely. So I don't know if that helps, but I think I'm agreeing with Mira and actually saying, there is space. There's standard deviation around these.
Yeah. And there's another brilliant question now from Mary Cox from Economic Growth and Skills. So she says, working changed and obviously COVID changed opportunities for authentic interaction. How does a leader newly formed team encourage real sharing of self? And I think this is the wider question, isn't it, that I'm sure lots of people are struggling with, is with the new ways of working where we're not seeing each other in the flesh like we were. How do we sort of manage this authentic exchanges of information and relationship building and leadership?
It was quite interesting because we were just talking before, and really love having the personal connection and actually being with each other. I think a mix is really, really good. I actually think that I reframe this sometimes, because I actually think that the virtual world that we're working in and building teams in and relationships in sometimes actually makes us better at this, because you actually have to be much more intentional about it. And there's a bit of me that sort of thinks, well, I wonder whether we really did have those relationships when we were physically in the same space in all cases anyway. And I'm sure we did to some extent, and in other cases I'm not sure whether we did. When those exchanges, etc., are not always completely authentic. At the end of the day, relationships are built on reciprocity, whether you're the boss or a peer or however your relationship is. All human relationships are built on a degree of reciprocity. So I share something, you share something, I share something, you share something, and we build a depth of trust and connection. So if you are, in the leadership position wanting to build that sense of trust with your team, it's about being the first to share, being the first to take that sort of next step, asking questions. So, being in a position of giving, and then someone else will give something, and those relationships start to build, and you start to create safer spaces for wider conversations. So I think reciprocity building and taking the first step is always the job of the leader, because there's always a bit of hierarchy in the way that sometimes means other people might feel a bit, they can't do that. But the other thing I think is what the virtual world has given us, if we think of it from that perspective, a positive person, is the opportunity to be much more intentional and put more time into it. Because we can take it for granted when we're together, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that connection is actually there. Whereas if we know that that's what it takes, we do actually have to be a bit more intentional about it. It's not going to happen by chance or spontaneously. We've got to actually, you know, make an effort to build that. But that is no different to many successful organisations working globally like this over a period of time. So it's not necessarily for me the medium, it's the what you're doing that makes a difference. And I actually think we could take some of the disciplines that we've been practicing and trying to put in place in our virtual world more into our physical world as well. Would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Another very interesting comment, clarity is key. However, when dealing within a culture of constant crisis and ambiguity, how can clarity be demonstrated?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because often actually in a crisis situation, things are much more clear than they are in, you know, a normal working day. Because, you know, usually in a crisis, there's a very, very clear problem. There's a very, very clear set of things that need to be done. There's a very, very clear, you know, there's often not a lot of time, so there isn't time to keep debating who's doing what. So people go off and do, and there's a greater degree of trust that I'm doing my bit, you're doing your bit. So often we do, and that may or may not be everyone's experience, but often actually crisis creates a degree of clarity. What I think can happen is an organisation that is in serial crisis loses some of that because actually that is the norm of the organisation, sensitized to the crisis situation, and in actual fact business as usual is just extremes of, you know, all the emotions that we fear, you know, that we feel, but it's multiple crises. So if it's one crisis, everyone's focused on it, it's clear, it's quite helpful and instructional. And often people will say, oh, you know, in a way they sort of miss the crisis because they created a great team or camaraderie around solving that problem. But if you're in an organisation that is in multiple crises all of the time, and that actually is your norm, you know, there's some work to be done, isn't there? And it does come back to prioritisation and clarity and expectation and who's going to do what and when, because I imagine in those situations it's just overwhelming because what do you not do? Because everything needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think in the absence of, so I think sometimes we are waiting for, and I've seen this right all the way up to the top of organisations, everybody's still waiting sort of for somebody else to say, right, you've got 20 things that are an absolute priority, but here's the 3. Or here's the 10, to be realistic. And I sort of think at the end of the day, as a leader, we lead from where we are with what we have. So actually, sometimes you just have to make a call. But again, if you communicate that, then I think you can create that clarity for your team and make sure that, you know, you can create a sense of wellness in that. Because otherwise, you know, nothing gets done well either. And it can start to be burnout. So absolutely. Crisis for a short period of time on one thing, I think can be really instructional and helpful for us in terms of clarity. Ongoing crisis requires us to step up as a leader and actually make some proposals or say what you're going to do, transparently communicate that, and then go away and do that. And if you need to course correct that along the way, fine.
I would also add to that going back to this concept of what can I do? So to that answer to that question, you know, I can understand. I think we see so much change going on in the sector, but to be honest, we're experiencing change globally, everywhere, every day, aren't we? It's very uncertain times that we're facing, and I think if we think about back to what you said earlier, and I often talk about this with my teams as well, if you had drew a box, and in one side you wrote what can I control, and the other side you wrote what can't I control, and if we just focus more on the things we can do something about, so building my own personal resilience and physical and mental well-being, so that I can go into my work, whether I'm a leader or whatever role I'm in, and I've got more energy and more buffer for managing this roller coaster that I'm on, if it's a particular one or if it's just sort of these day-to-day challenges. There are lots of very interesting questions coming up. So somebody was asking about the article that I talked about, and I think somebody very kindly posted it. It was the Forbes article, so thank you for sharing that. There was a question to you, Paula, about the questionnaire you recommended to gauge team stresses, and somebody asked if you might be able to share that and how often you run those questionnaires.
I'm just trying to think what that was. I think I was referencing broader engagement surveys.
Oh yes, right, yeah.
I just have a point about broader engagement surveys, though, is that so again, I think, you know, we've just been talking about accountability and personal agency as a leader. So you as an organisation will have your engagement surveys, and they'll give you some really useful information. And by the way, most of the useful information is in the verbatim comments.
Yeah.
There is an issue, though, sometimes with those surveys, in that A, there's a time lag between when you get them, and secondly, some of the questions are a bit vanilla. So remember, you'll probably all recognise the question, senior leadership, you know, is effective around here, or senior leadership, you know, communicates with clarity, or whatever. There's usually a question similar to that. And it was, who is senior leadership? And it, you know, so sometimes those questions are not that helpful. So they have their place. There's nothing stopping anyone coming up with a little survey for their teams, or co-creating it with their teams using, you know, Microsoft Forms if you've got it, or anything like that, where you yourselves can kind of think about, right, what's important to us and how are we going to know where we are? And, you know, let's do something just together. And, you know, there's nothing stopping you as a leader if you want information, for going out and creating some information for yourself, you know, 5 quick questions at the end of every week, because you're really interested in how people are doing. You know, and then over time you can kind of build a trend. So I'm not suggesting that you're there to do this sort of broader functional job within your organisation or take over these things, but you can complement a lot of these things by just thinking, what do I want to know? And I can actually go and find this information out for myself. You know, and again, you know, if you do that with enough anonymity, etc., you know, people can kind of respond to it. And again, co-creating it with people is fantastic.
Absolutely.
You know, because then we're like, well, this is important to us, right? Okay, let's see how we're doing against that then. So I don't know that I was referring to a particular questionnaire that I have or I use. Most organisations will have their engagement survey. I think it has its place, it's useful, all good. And where is the gaps for that for you as a leader, and how do you want to fill it?
And I think that's a brilliant idea, doing something with your team together. I mean, I use a tool called Mentimeter. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. You can use the free version. It's fantastic. It's so easy to use, and it's fun, and it's great to kind of have that temperature check. And actually, what I find when I use that with teams is that employees say things that the leaders have never heard before, and sometimes even other colleagues have never heard those employees say that. And it's very different, I find, when I go into a room of 40 or 50 people, especially if their leadership team are in that room. If I was just sort of doing a very typical thing and asking people to share verbally, I would get hardly any insights or data. When you give people an anonymous code and everybody's contributing on a screen, one of the things that happens immediately is the walls come down. People realize this is a safe space because it's anonymous, but also because all of a sudden people are actually opening up, and they suddenly feel, oh, I'm not the only one who feels like this. So I think that's a brilliant idea. Sarah has asked a question. So not all leaders are brought into the function my team offers, so push back against the function of staff when they join the team. I've recently taken on the role and have a plan which is collaborative to work with leaders to gain their buy-in, but what can I do in the short term to help my staff thrive while I'm working to shift the mindset of leaders?
Yes, I'm just trying to make sure I've got the question right. So so it sounds like you're working with your leaders, trying to kind of, create mindset shifts, but equally not necessarily, that's taking time. And in the meantime, how do you kind of create the motivation and engagement with your team? I go actually back to Kat's point, and I talk about this a lot, the control, what's in your control and what's not in your control.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think there's that piece to it. So what can you control and what can you do as a group? I talk a lot about, I was just writing an article about this yesterday, microclimates. So what can I control and how can I create a sort of a microclimate? Because if you create a microclimate, what are the things that you can do within your culture that sit within the bigger culture but might be completely different, where your team can really thrive? And that microclimate, after a while, will start to sort of seep out and actually create influence in the rest of the organisation, because you'll be productive, people will be engaged, you'll see the results, etc., and people will start looking at you and wondering what particular team. So I think what's in your control in creating microclimates is, and the stuff that isn't in your control, you've got to let it go a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a bit like the finite time, infinite amount of stuff. So focus on the things that are within your control. There is another thing that I would love to share actually with the group, which is often from a leadership perspective, we're focused on the problems and solving the problems. So, how do I create more engagement, or how do I do this, or how do I do that? How do I stop this from happening? How do I, solve this problem? But what we know from neuroscience and the way the brain works, and so we're dealing with humans, is that actually, if we can paint, and this goes into my point about clarity, if we can paint a picture of actually where we're going, you don't have to spend as much time solving the problems, because you engage people in where they're going and they start to veer towards there. So you focus your energy on creating and painting a picture of where we're going, the future, the positive energy, etc. It doesn't mean to say that you're not working on some of those things, but you're sort of orienting people towards the positive future rather than constantly focusing on the problems, so you get more of those. So there's a beautiful fable that you might have heard of the wind and the sun, and the person with the coat. I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but no. So the wind and the sun are, in the sky, and the wind's a bit bored, and they look down on the ground, and there's a gentleman walking along with a big coat, and the wind says, I bet you I can get that coat off that man. And so he blows and blows and blows, gets really sort of puffed out, getting a bit cross, and the man the more he blows, the more he pulls the coat around him, and in the end the wind just falls back and says, I can't do it, stupid man, he won't take his coat off, and I've tried really hard. Good luck, sun, you're not going to be able to do anything. The sun beams down on this person and he takes his own coat off. And so from a leadership perspective, it's all about being more sun than it is more wind. The things we focus on, if we can focus on creating some kind of energy, some kind of focus, some kind of, purpose or vision for what we're trying to create together, good people will flock towards that work.
Yeah.
And they will take their own coats off, and we won't have to tell them how to take their coat off or whatever. They will just be engaged. So that, coming back to that first point we made about, can you engage people or do they engage themselves? The sun creates the conditions. It's now hot, the person takes their own coat off. How do we as leaders create the conditions for our teams to thrive? Yes, we can focus on the problems, but one of the things we can control is, what's the point of us all being together? What are we trying to do? Prioritizing this. We're going over there. Is everybody coming with me? I want you to come. You're going to be brilliant at this. You're going to be brilliant at that. The power of suggestion, and create a sort of a positive energy for people to gravitate towards, rather than being stuck in, And then everybody will find more contentment and joy in what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I think if you can find that for yourself as a leader, it will naturally be part of what you create for the team around you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, this is just, it's such a fascinating subject, but it's a really, really important one. And I know that we had one of the highest registrations for this particular event today, because I think this is something that so many of us are struggling with. So just because I'm conscious of time, we've only got a few minutes left, I want to try and tie it all together. I'm sorry we didn't get time to answer all the questions and all the chat, but do get in touch with us if you want to discuss any of these things in more detail. And you've been a fantastic audience today, because I don't know if you've noticed while we've been talking, but people have been sharing links. So somebody just asked where the article was, and somebody shared it, and somebody was trying to work out what Mentimeter was, and somebody very kindly shared the link to it. So thank you for doing that. So I'm just going to try and summarize, because I think, as I said right at the beginning, it's really important that we've had this great discussion and it's been helpful. Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. But that people who are watching this either live or recorded can go away and maybe just put one thing into practice within their role as a leader or an aspiring leader. So just to summarize some of those things that we've talked about, I think the idea of gauging your staff with some kind of survey is a really good practical thing that you could do straight away. So, and I think often as leaders, we try and work out the answer to our questions, don't we, rather than asking people directly who are impacted. So actually talking to your team, co-designing it, and then getting their feedback is a really good one, as well as this concept of focusing on what you can control. I really like the 3 things, 3 years. It's a really easy thing to do very quickly and to remember. Getting clarity, prioritizing, painting the picture of where we're going. But I think one of the most interesting things you said was looking at your own behaviour, and I think, you know, for me this is very prominent in the work. So if you know, look within yourself if you want to create a thriving culture for employees, because they will be looking at you, won't they?
Yeah, and it's how people experience you. So, you know, as human beings, we take our cues from what we experience. So if I walk into a room as a leader and I'm calm and I've got a clear idea of what I'm doing and I look like I'm enjoying it, and even if it's a difficult subject matter, which I'm sure many people are sort of doing difficult work, it's important. So the favourite question that I have in any moment, in any given time, is what is the point? And I've often sat in meetings, you know, all sorts of meetings, where I've sort of sat there and thought, what is the point? What is the point of this? What's the point of what our team is here to do?
Yeah.
What is the point of what I'm here to do? Create conditions for people to thrive. What is the point? You know, who's the end customer? Why did we set this up in the first place?
Yes.
You know, so what is the point? It's an easier question than purpose, which can sometimes feel like it's a bit tenuous. What is the point? And that can always bring you back to, well, it's easy to prioritize when you know what the point is.
Absolutely.
It's really important that you as the leader are able to answer these questions for yourself, because once you can, you show up in a way that other people will magnetize towards. So, you know, there's a concept, I haven't got time to sort of talk about it in detail now, but I've written about it, which is the concept between push leadership and magnetic leadership. And I suppose it's exemplified in the example of the wind and the sun. And so this is something I think I always ask myself, and I ask of anyone who's in a leadership position, who do you want to be? At the end of every day, every week, every month, do you want to be the wind who's got a bit stressed and is exhausted and is sort of, you know, pushing? And someone might blow the coat off the person, but they'll be exhausted. Or do you want to be the sun, where how you are creates the outcomes that you're looking for? And I think, you know, that ability to create people magnetizing towards you as a leader and what you're trying to do, rather than you having to push it to make it happen, is a really interesting concept to explore. And there's loads of things I've written about that.
Yeah,
so.
and what a brilliant ending. Like, what a fantastic way to bring this to a close. Do you want to be the wind or the sun? I think this has been fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on, coming into sunny London today and recording this live. Really hope all of you who are watching, wherever you are in the world or in your offices or home office, really hope you've enjoyed it as well today. If people want to learn more about you, Paula, or connect with you, where is the best place for them to find you? Is it LinkedIn?
Yeah, LinkedIn is absolutely the best. So I'm Paula Leach, Leach on LinkedIn. So come and join me. I put up various different articles and bits and pieces and things on there, and it's great. I am just on a mission to help leaders be more content in themselves and therefore create thriving workplaces. So anyone who's interested in that would be wonderful to connect with you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for joining us. And if you are watching this on the recording, thanks for taking the time to listen, and looking forward to the next In Conversation With very soon. Wishing you all a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.